Ayubowan everyone, welcome to the Iron Bloods Institute. This is the first episode of a series named Our Elites Just Suck. In this series, we are going to discuss why our current elites suck and are so bad at doing their job. Then, we are going to exactly pinpoint the problems Sri Lanka is facing at the moment and discuss how said problems could be solved relatively easily. I'll give you a hint. This is not rocket science, and the solutions can be reached by anyone having the knowledge or experience level of a bachelor's degree, plus access to the internet. In part 1 of this series, we will discuss the root cause of the Sri Lankan crisis. To find the root cause of any problem, business and engineering students are taught to perform a simple root cause analysis. Since this is a socio-economic issue, we selected the 5 whys technique. We start with the problem, in this case Sri Lanka's political crisis. Subsequently, we ask ourselves why 5 to 7 times until we arrive at the root cause of the problem. Based on the root cause analysis we performed, the prime cause that led to Sri Lanka's current economic turmoil can be narrowed down to these 3. Number 1, embracing neoliberal economic policies. Number 2, gross incompetence. And number 3, the cost of energy and Sri Lanka's energy dependence. However, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we will focus on the root cause of Sri Lanka's crisis, and that root cause is the neoliberal policies that Sri Lanka implemented since 1977, when J R Jayawardene became the first president. These policies have been pursued by both left and right-wing parties when they eventually came into power. Pursuing these policies meant the death of the manufacturing economy, and eventually Sri Lanka became much more reliant on volatile sectors like tourism to bring in foreign currency. As we dive deeper into how neoliberal policies affected Sri Lanka, you will understand why I named this series Our Elites Just Suck. I would venture to say that neoliberalism has been a dead end since the day it was implemented in this country. Our elites suck because they are trying to solve the problems caused by neoliberalism using neoliberalism itself. This paper by Professor Lalit elaborates that rather than solve our problems, it is bound to add fuel to the fire. There are a million videos on YouTube itself on neoliberalism. Frankly, I do not care what the definitions of neoliberalism is to various people and various institutions. I am more interested in the effects it has on nations that decide to implement it. Nations that do usually have extensive deregulation, which leads to the death of local industries. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Hint: this is exactly what happened in Sri Lanka after 1977, when small business owners lost their livelihoods. They embrace globalism, Western values, and Western culture. Again, hint: sound familiar? They privatize their state-owned enterprises and national assets. Again, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Hint: this is exactly what happened in the early 2000s when Chandrika Bandaranaike was in power. The regime either sold, privatized, and shut down SOEs following the doctrine. This is also the same thing Ranil Wickremesinghe wants to do right now in late 2022 with all the talks of privatizing even profitable enterprises like Sri Lanka Telecom. JR implemented these policies to ruin the power of unions, and his protege, Mr. Wickremesinghe, is known to have an adversarial relationship with unions. If you check YouTube for his latest parliamentary speeches, he continually attacks unions and advocates removing legislation that provides job security to Sri Lankan employees. Let's get into the meat and potatoes, shall we? How has neoliberal doctrine affected Sri Lanka's balance of payment management? As you may know, balance of payment is the amount of money or wealth entering and exiting a country in a year. When balancing a nation's payments, even advanced level students in Sri Lanka pursuing the commerce subjects know that there are 2 main accounts on the matter: the current account and the capital account. For now, let's focus on the current account. The most important thing to pay attention to here are the trade balance, remittances, and investment income. Trade balance simply means the difference between the value of import and export. So long as exports bring in more foreign currency than what imports cost us, we're good. If you remember, remittances was another way that Sri Lanka gained foreign currency which dried up along with tourism when COVID-19 hit. If the income we get from exports is higher than the cost of our imports, we have a trade surplus. If the income we get from exports is lower than the cost of our imports, we have a trade deficit. This is simple, advanced level economics. Research shows us that when it comes to Sri Lanka, any increase in our deficit causes an increase in our exchange rate. That means the Sri Lankan rupee depreciates against the dollar, making the dollar more expensive. According to neoliberal theory, a depreciation in the Sri Lankan rupee against the US dollar should reduce the cost of our exports and increase the demand, theoretically solving the deficit issue. However, the key word here is theoretically. In reality, this is not always the case. Just because our exports become cheaper doesn't mean there will be more buyers for it. The purchase of some goods doesn't depend on price. For example, specialized mechanical parts and computer technology. Perhaps other nations that purchase our products too are having economic slowdowns and cannot afford to purchase anymore. Perhaps that is all the market needs. Many things influence the income generated from exports apart from exchange rate. Let us assume a nation dogmatically follows neoliberal policies, causing a continual trade deficit. What happens to a nation that continuously runs a trade deficit and a resulting current account deficit for around 45 years? Remember our A-level economics class? A trade deficit is when income from exports exceeds the expenses of imports. When a nation continually runs a trade deficit, its foreign reserves decrease because it is using these to pay for imports. The only option left is to borrow foreign currencies to pay for imports. This graph is a history of our foreign reserves since 1970. Ideally, since Sri Lanka has been running a current account deficit since 1977, our foreign reserves should decrease, correct? However, we can see sudden spikes in our foreign reserves around 2007. Isn't this curious? How could this be? Looking at our trade deficit again, there has been no change. So how has our foreign reserves increased? Let us zoom in into this curious area of the graph and see if we can learn any information. There we are. That makes things a lot clearer, doesn't it? 2007 was the year Sri Lanka started issuing sovereign bonds in the international financial markets. We use these debts to finance our ever-increasing trade deficits. That was how we had foreign currency to pay for our imports. Debt and borrowings were used to prop up our economy. These were the economic props that were used by all regimes since 2007 to pay for imports and prevent the Sri Lankan rupee crashing against the dollar. In fact, the largest borrowing was done by Mr. Wickremesinghe when he was in power the last time. Since Sri Lanka's credit rating fell and our bonds could not be sold on the market, our reserves and consequently the Sri Lankan rupee has started to nosedive. If you remember this slide, that was, after all, the final option remaining for a nation running out of reserves. Sri Lankan politicians and elites realized that other incomes like remittances and tourism in our current account were not sufficient to pay for our trade deficit. So, they decided to use our capital account. As you now understand, Sri Lankan elites decided to finance our current account deficit using money borrowed via our sovereign bonds. Of course, they also used bilateral loans from the ADB, World Bank, India, China, and Japan, but we relied mostly on debt from sovereign bonds. So this is how we have been managing our economy since 2007. Even though we ran a current account deficit since 1977, we started using debt from sovereign bonds, international banks, and bilateral loans to bridge the gap in our reserves caused by the trade deficit. This graph shows us how Sri Lanka's foreign debt has evolved over the decades. The green cycle on the right shows that despite valid criticisms leveled against the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime, I give them credit for not resorting to further increasing Sri Lanka's debt as a method to overcome the crisis. History has shown us that all previous regimes resorted to debt to solve our balance of payments problems, while only the GR regime did not. They made some bad policy choices, like banning nitrogen fertilizer and militarization of the vaccination drive. But when it came to debt, only the GR regime began repaying the debt and tried decreasing it, instead of taking the easy route of borrowing ever further. In hindsight, if the GR regime actually increased our debt, as previous regimes did in the past, there's a possibility that he would still be in power. Ironic, isn't it? The green circle indicating the period between 1994 and 2002 was also a time when our foreign debt did not increase. Despite this, Sri Lanka was still following the neoliberal doctrine and was running a current account deficit. As it is now common knowledge, the Chandrika Ranil regimes at the time oversaw a wave of privatization of state-owned enterprises and state-owned assets. So, putting it all together, Sri Lanka is facing a balance of payments disaster because it has been using a neoliberal doctrine to create its economic policies since 1977. These policies have driven Sri Lanka to multiple economic catastrophes. Now, our elites and politicians are trying to find solutions to the current economic crisis caused by neoliberalism using the same neoliberal framework. This is the height of insanity and ignorance, and it is why this series is titled Our Elites Just Suck. As Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Our elites and the people that have been elected to govern us don't have the simplest ability to even balance a checkbook. This is a skill that even someone who has completed his advanced level exam has. I highly doubt our elites will ever wake up and realize neoliberalism is the root cause of our problems, and using it to solve our current calamity is going to be like adding fuel to the fire. Maybe try sharing this video series with them. If they still ignore you and use the same old doctrine, we can be sure they have no patriotism to Sri Lanka and are willing to destroy the nation just to be in power. So in summary, how to ruin a country in 3 easy steps. If the situation wasn't so dire, it would be funny how much this looks like a guide for greedy businessmen, politicians and elites to get rich off the backs of the working class. Step 1. Implement neoliberal policies for about 45 years. Step 2. Continually run a current account deficit and get bailed out by the IMF about 16 times, not realizing or caring that neoliberalism itself is the issue. Finally, get debt from foreign nations, banks, and financial institutions, making Sri Lanka a slave to debtors. Oh, if you have any contingency plans for economic shocks, you are making a mistake. No plan is the way to go. As I said before, our elites just suck and don't have the simplest ability to even balance a checkbook. This is a skill that even someone who has completed his advanced level exam has. They will simply do the same thing over and over again because that's all they know to do and simply don't care. That's the end of this video. If you found it informative, please like and subscribe to make the algorithm gods happy. Also, leave me a comment if you see that I have made any errors or if you just want to say hi. Thanks for watching. Cheers.